Good evening, everybody. My name is Charles Duggan. I'm Heritage Officer here in Dublin City Council. Thank you all for coming to this evening's lecture presented by Helen Litton. This is the 7th lecture in our series of monthly lectures held in the Oak Room. Through this series, which is part funded by the Heritage Council's County Heritage Plan Grant Scheme, we aim to showcase new publications, new research and topics of importance relating to Dublin City and of course and making room for a greater diversity of voices, and to share new perspectives on all stories and to tell stories that haven't been told yet. Before introducing Helen, I would like to thank my colleague Abigail O'Reilly for her work in helping to organise this series, and of course the staff of the Mansion House, and of course to our sign language interpreters who do an amazing job every month, Cormac and Sarah. So now to introduce Helen Litton. Helen is the author of 6 illustrated history books and of 2 volumes in the O'Brien Press series, 16 Live series, Edward Daly and Thomas Clarke. She is the editor of Revolutionary Women, the autobiography of Kathleen Clarke, and she is married with 2 children and 2 grandchildren and lives in Dublin. Helen is also grandniece of Kathleen Clarke, and in her talk, Kathleen Clarke, Alive Proclaimed, she will discuss both the memoir that she has written and some of the findings from research she undertook in 2023, for which she was awarded an MLit by Trinity College Dublin. So would you please put your hands together and welcome Helen to the podium. Thank
you. Good evening. Thank you all very much for coming out on such a lovely sunny day. I hope you can hear me all right. Thank you. Kathleen Daly Clarke, who is my grandmother's sister, was born in Limerick in April 1878, the third daughter of Edward Daly and Catherine O'Mara. Edward and his brother John Daly had taken part in the 1867 Fenian Rising, and from 1884 John Daly spent 12 years in British prisons in explosive charges. Can I see if this works? Yes, it does. That is John Daly as a young man. Quite the man about town. Edward Daly died in September 1890, aged 41, leaving his wife Catherine with 8 daughters and expecting her last child, who was their only son, Edward, known as Ned. The family fell on hard times after their father died, but were assisted by another brother of Edward called James, a returned emigrant, who supported them until John Daly was released from prison in 1896. Kathleen, the third daughter, trained as a dressmaker and tailor when she left school and established a successful business with her sister Agnes. John Daly had made a close friend in prison, a younger man called Tom Clarke. Aged by 15 years of imprisonment, he looked a lot older than he was. But when John was elected the first nationalist mayor of Limerick in 1899, he invited Tom, who had then just been released on licence, to visit Limerick and accept the freedom of the city. Kathleen, then 20, fell in love with Tom, who was 20 years older than she. And in 1901, they married in New York. Despite all family resistance, her mother wasn't at all happy at the idea. This is a photograph, a composite photograph of the two of them just before they left to get married. And this is a photograph of Kathleen's with her sisters and her brother Ned right at the end there. Kathleen is the one in the middle, just before she left for the States in 1901. They had a son, John Daly, known as Daly Clarke, in 1902, and Tom Clarke worked with John Devoy, the leader of Gael in New York, and managed Devoy's newspaper, the Gaelic American. When Tom realised that war might be brewing in Europe, he persuaded Kathleen to return to Ireland in 1908, but she was very reluctant. She couldn't see that there would be a good end to this, but she couldn't resist his impulse to fight. If there was a war on, he felt that this was an opportunity for Ireland to try and fight Britain. His life's ambition was to fight for Ireland's independence, and he never lost sight of that ambition. Gael sent money with him, and Tom began to pull together the old Irish Republican Brotherhood, which had gone more or less dormant in Dublin. He brought in younger men such as Seán MacDiarmada, Bulmer Hobson, Dennis McCullough and Patrick Pearse, and his cover was as a newsagent and a tobacconist. Ultimately, he opened a shop in Parnell Street and one in Amiens Street. Kathleen took a full part in these activities, helping to run the shops and distribute the funds from the USA. They had 2 more children, Tom in 1908 and Emmett in 1909. In 1913, the Irish Volunteers were founded, and Kathleen's brother Ned was one of the very first to join, ultimately becoming Commandant of the 1st Battalion. In 1914, she herself was a founder member of Commandant, and for a time she ran the Central Branch. After the Easter Rising, which I think I do not need to, I hope, go into detail here, Tom and Ned were both executed along with Seán MacDiarmada, a close friend of the family. Kathleen suffered a miscarriage shortly afterwards and almost died. She threw herself into the establishment of the Volunteer Dependence Fund and became also a member of Sinn Fein, entering politics for the first time. In May 1918, she was among a number of senior Sinn Fein members arrested under the guise of a German plot and spent almost a year in Holloway with Countess Markovitz and Maud Gonne. This photograph is of Kathleen with her sons after the Rising. There was a whole series of these photographs published of the widows with their children. All very moving. She spent almost a year in Holloway, and when she was released in February 1919, she caught the Spanish flu when she was travelling home. Again, she almost died. All her life, Kathleen suffered from severely ill health, but she never deals with it very much in the memoir. During this time, her sons were cared for by their aunts in Limerick, and this care continued during her early years in politics. In 1920, she was elected Dublin City Councillor for Sinn Fein. She remained a councillor for decades. During the War of Independence, she acted as a judge in the North Dublin Dáil courts. She was a founder member of the Irish White Cross, which distributed charitable donations from the USA. During these years, her home and the homes of her family in Limerick were frequently raided. The contents of her mother's home in the Ennis Road were burned in a bonfire in the street in October 1920. Kathleen was elected to the Dáil in the general election of 1921. Like all the Sinn Féin TDs at that election, she was unopposed. She had been good friends with Michael Collins since his days as Secretary of the IVDF, but when the treaty was signed, she told him she could not agree to him. She was one of the main opposition speakers in the treaty debates and followed de Valera out of the Dáil, losing her seat in the 1922 election. As one of the founder members of Fianna Fail, she won a Dáil seat in 1927, lost it again in 1928. She then won a Senate election with the highest number of Fianna Fail votes and remained a senator until 1936 when de Valera abolished the Senate. When Fianna Fail had gone into government in 1932, she found herself questioning some of its policies, particularly in relation to partition and the Irish language. One of her most high-profile rows with de Valera was over the 1937 Constitution, when she joined all the other female members of the Oireachtas in opposition to the woman clauses, which we've been hearing a lot about recently. She had been elected Dublin councillor in 1920, but the council was suspended between 1924 and 1930, but she took up the position again when it was reconstituted, and from 1932, Fianna Fail nominated her annually for the position of Lord Mayor. In 1939, on the casting vote of the outgoing Mayor, Alfie Byrne, she took a famous step in being elected the first woman Lord Mayor of Dublin, a position she held from... Why is this not going? Sorry. No, sorry, this is meant to be moving. Oh no, it's that one. I'm sorry about this. A position she held for 2 years. It was the highest paid political office in the Irish Free State at about $2,500 per annum. Her first act was to reject the Lord Mayor's chain because it had been a gift from King William III, and she wore a smaller chain throughout her mayoralty. She also banished all portraits of English royalty and nobility from the Mansion House, as you can see from the Dublin Opinion cartoon. And she's saying Veni Vidi Vic. And she put them all outside the railings of the house, where people going to work in the morning were astounded. Fortunately, the Board of Works came forward and rescued them all. I noticed most of them have crept back into the Mansion House, but there you go. She became mayor just as the Second World War was beginning. That's her official portrait as Lord Mayor, with that chain, which was, I think, the chain of the Court of Conscience, it's called. She became mayor at the Second World War was beginning. She involved herself in appeals for the Red Cross, child welfare. She was suspicious of Ireland's neutrality policy, aware that it tilted more towards Britain, and clashed with the government about the arrest and executions of several IRA members, deliberately flying the City Hall flag at half-mast in protest. She underwent a serious operation in 1941 and did not stand again. She also finally resigned from Fianna Fail. She writes, "I liked public life, and I liked having a say in the affairs of my country and felt I had earned the right to do so, but the qualities which made for success in the War of Independence were no longer needed. She spent the next 20 years serving on numerous boards and committees, mostly in the field of social work. In 1966, she was conferred with an honorary doctorate by the National University of Ireland as part of the 50th commemorations of the Rising. She then moved to live with her son Emmett and his family in Liverpool, where she died on the 19th of September 1972, suffering from dementia. She was given a state funeral in Dublin and is buried in Dign's Grange Cemetery with her son Daly, who predeceased her. Now, Clarke seems to have begun writing her memoir, Revolutionary Woman, while she was Lord Mayor of Dublin in the early 1940s. She originally wished to publish it before she died, but was apparently advised that some remarks might be libelous, and she refused to change anything. Ultimately, she embargoed it till after her death, when no one could argue with her. When I worked in publishing, and when I met her son Emmett, I asked him about her fabled memoir, because it was fabled in the family that she had written this, and every so often someone was mentioned, she would say, I dealt with him in my book. But nobody had ever seen this. But Emmett had it in a drawer in his house in Liverpool and was not in a position to publish it himself. So I took it over and brought it to O'Brien Press and edited it for publication. It was launched on the 2nd of April 1991 by Bertie Ahern, then Minister for Labour, and Emmett flew over from Liverpool for the occasion, as you can see. Almost all of the reviews of the book were favourable because it was notable as a first-hand account of the revolutionary years, as not many were available back then, and also because it was by a woman, who's a very rare occurrence. It would seem her primary aim in writing the memoir was to recover Tom Clarke's position in the pantheon of revolutionary leaders. He was the ultimate backroom man, keeping out of the limelight, partly because he had been released on licence and therefore could be arrested at any time for political activity. He was not bothered about who got credit for anything, which meant his role was almost unknown to anyone except those who were in the inner circle of the IRB, a very closed circle. He was therefore easily eclipsed by the charismatic Pearse, the intellectual Plunkett, the magnetic MacDiarmada, or the fiery socialist Connolly. This wounded Kathleen to her soul, and she was determined to set the record straight, no matter whom she annoyed. Her remarks about Pearse, for example, in the memoir, are quite negative, and she has several digs at de Valera. As well as Tom, however, I think she was also concerned to remind people of the role played by her own Daly family of Limerick. If I go back here a bit, you can see that, yes, that is Kathleen as a young woman. She's second from the right in the back there. And that's her mother at the far end, with the youngest child. The youngest child, Ned, is in the front. And you can see at the age of 3 or whatever it is, he has a toy rifle. I don't think he ever had a chance, poor Ned. And that was their grandmother. There's one of these large Edwardian families that you find. These old people all lived under the same roof. And presumably it was a couple of servants as well. They were reasonably well off because of James Daly, the man in the middle there, the returned emigrant, who spent a lot of money on his widowed sister-in-law and her family. So I believe she was concerned to remind people that the Daly family of Limerick had been quite instrumental in the planning and so on of the Easter Rising. She focused also on her brother Ned, who was 25 when he was executed on the 4th of May 1916. He was Commandant of the Four Courts, an extremely active and intelligent military strategist, but in the history of the Revolution he is simply one of the forgotten 7. That is, of the 14 executed men, 7 signed the Proclamation and the others didn't. And it's the ones that signed the Proclamation who get the most attention. It has always seemed to me an unfair distinction, and so it seems it did to Kathleen. After the Easter Rising, although the Daly family, her sisters, some of them continued in Commandant for some years, the family retired from public life. The memoir, Revolutionary Woman, became a bestseller because it sold 1,500 copies in the first year. The paperback in 1993 also sold well, and a new edition was introduced in 2008, to which I added a longer epilogue, filling in some of her public statements in the Dáil and the Senate. It was greatly welcomed by historians of the revolutionary period, particularly those researching the role of women. It appeared long before the publication of the witness statements and the pension applications held by the Bureau of Military History, and was immediately recognised as a distinctive first-person voice, giving a new slant to early 20th century Irish history. And it has since appeared in almost every bibliography dealing with those years, A couple of sections of it are quoted in Volume 5 of the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing. However, since its publication, a huge volume of research on the Revolution period has continued, and matters that once seemed simple and straightforward have become more nuanced. I was aware that some accounts of particular events differed from Kathleen's, and of course a memoir can only have one point of view, that of the writer. I decided it would be interesting to dig a little deeper, to compare her accounts with those of others, to maybe add some wider context to events which she passes over briefly, and to delve into the bitter arguments she carried on in later years whenever anyone made a statement or recalled an event which differed from her recollection. Although she says in her introduction that some things might have become confused after the passage of time, she was writing nearly 30 years after the Rising, she would later never publicly admit any confusion or mistake. My study was informed by my own experience of psychotherapy over more than 20 years. I have learned how we create memories and sometimes have to learn to dismantle them. I cannot deny my own participation in the publication of this memoir. I prepared it for publication and I've talked about it over the years. And for any family member who's engaged in this kind of thing, there are bound to be difficult moments. You can be tempted to soften an anecdote slightly or shine a better light on the protagonist. I hope I've successfully avoided this, but it is always a risk. The book consists of a lot of dramatic set pieces, living as she did in interesting times, but she skates over the War of Independence fairly lightly, and also the Civil War, which was an incredibly difficult thing to write about. She gives about 2 pages of the Civil War. There are only occasional glimpses of family life and activity. She was concerned not to sound emotional or sentimental, and the book is often sternly matter-of-fact, even when dealing with traumatic events. She would not have approved of today's demands for blood and guts on the page. So when I came to, I signed on to in Trinity College to do an MLit on the memoir and just explore it more fully. In terms of Kathleen's political career, I examined records relating to Dublin City Council, Sinn Fein, Fianna Fail, records of Dawn's Senate. She served on finance committees in both Sinn Fein and Fianna Fail and was influential on both. It was a very difficult decision for her to leave Sinn Fein and follow de Valera into the new party, Fianna Fail, but you could see that Sinn Fein was in a cul-de-sac. The Irish people seeking security were tired of war and belligerent talk, and joining Dáil Éireann was really the only way forward. But much to the disgust of her sisters, the whole family kind of split on this issue, as many families did. They couldn't understand how Kathleen could enter the Dáil, refusing to sign the oath of allegiance, and just accepting what they saw as a British thing, as something that as puppets of the British. She became a member of the National Executive Fianna Fail with 5 other women. This is a very high percentage of women for the time. This could have been a recognition of their importance as founder members, but I'm inclined to believe that this was simply to use the links of such well-known women as Countess Markievicz and Mrs. Pearse with the earlier revolution period, because Fianna Fail was being accused by Sinn Fein of betrayal, and it needed to emphasise its continuity of the past. It is notable, perhaps, that subsequent histories of Fianna Fail ignore the fact that any women were involved in its foundation, except for perhaps for an occasional mention of Countess Markievicz. Speaking at Fianna Fail event for the 90th anniversary of the Rising, Ahern name-checked Countess Markievicz and the women of the Pearse family, but there was no mention of Kathleen, even though he had launched the memoir 16 years before. Kathleen's efforts to redeem her place in Fianna Fail history seemed to have been completely in vain. She established a finance committee in which she was very active, with several other committees between 1927 and 1932. When they made the decision to enter the Dáil, she was the last to agree with the agonising decision of ignoring the oath of allegiance, and it was the last that had to be persuaded. During her time in politics, Fianna Fail was in opposition from 1928 to 1932, government from 1932 to 1948. The Senate records, in which she was a frequent speaker, provide an insight into the issues that engaged her attention: Workmen's Compensation Act, Road Traffic Acts, local government bills. Her approach was often one of sterling common sense. For example, she said that as a woman driver, she would not stop for a man signalling her unless he was in a police uniform. However, her pugnacious attitude to Britain never changed, and on a debate on nationality and citizenship in 1935, she objected strongly to a remark about friendship between the two countries, referring to British bullying and trickery. In 1934, the Carrigan Report was completed. This dealt with such matters as sexual offences, the age of consent, child abuse, prostitution. It was not published, probably in case Britain became aware of some of these matters in Holy Ireland, but there were a few media reports, and the Senate established a special committee on the Carrigan Report. Kathleen served on this committee. When the matter was debated, she made a contribution on the topic of contraception. It was not that she approved of it, but she objected to an outright ban on the grounds that it would simply encourage people to try to circumvent it. She added, "We should be able to appeal to the higher and nobler and more spiritual side of the human being." This is a touching sentiment, but I feel she must, during her social work, have met many desperate women whose greatest fear was that they would become pregnant again, and she was not dealing with reality here. But the fact that she spoke on this subject at all caused a lot of public comment, because decent women were not presumed to know anything about this sort of thing, let alone speak about it in public. Oliver St. John Gogarty praised her courage in addressing it, because the Carrigan Report had been effectively buried and the topic needed airing. But there was ultimately no public praise or commendation to be won here, and she knew it. She was brave to take on a share of the Senate's responsibility to report on the Carrigan Report. Other matters she spoke on included the Widows and Orphans Pension Bill, Nurses and Midwives Pension Bill. She was able to include personal experience and information on the necessity of these pensions. She was particularly forceful on the Conditions of Employment Bill of 1935, which aimed to ban women from certain jobs in industry. Almost all the women Oireachtas members united to oppose this paternalistic bill, which reduced women's rights under the guise of protection of the weaker sex, just 2 years before the Constitution cemented that attitude. She rejected a comment that she represented feminism gone mad, stating that she had never been a feminist, but based her opposition on the Proclamation, which had promised equal rights to all citizens. And as the title of my lecture says, this is her life proclaimed. The Proclamation was what she was guided by all of her life, and anything that fell beneath it she despised. And this was one of the reasons that she ultimately broke from Fianna Fail. She felt they had left the Proclamation far behind. It is clear, actually, if you look at the women, at the debates, if you read the debates in the Senate and the Dáil, it would curl your hair, and it is clear that women in the Oireachtas fought an uphill battle every day, pitting themselves against an almost all-male audience whose instinctive reaction to any mention of women was to jeer and whistle and make patronising comments. Even their own party members did not necessarily listen with respect to women's contributions. But certainly Kathleen had come a long way. Neither she nor Tom, in their wildest dreams, could have envisaged a future when Kathleen, as an elected representative, would stand in an Irish Parliament and seriously debate a wide range of topics affecting her constituents. Once Fianna Fail was in government, she found herself opposing some of his decisions. She saw the League of Nations as a British tool, and when de Valera joined the League of Nations and then planned to support Britain's calls for sanctions against Italy because of its treatment of Abyssinia in 1935, she argued that he should have bargained with Britain first for economic concessions. But de Valera insisted that if Ireland wanted justice for itself, it should also stand for justice for others. And it was brave of de Valera to vote in that way, because there was a good deal of support for Italy in Ireland. Kathleen just could not see beyond her hatred for Britain, and in the end never could. When the Speaker of Dáil Éireann proposed a vote of condolence on the death of King George V in 1936, she was furious. And when this was brought forward in the Senate, she was the only senator who dissented from the motion, attracting a good deal of opprobrium for being ungenerous and forgiving. She must have felt very lonely, and there's a little pen picture in the memoir of herself standing in the members' room only, and everybody else standing away from her. She was alienated from the rest, and they just saw her as unforgiving and bitter. When de Valera abolished the Senate unexpectedly in 1936, Kathleen was suddenly out of a job, and she expressed surprise in her memoir that she was not offered a paid position afterwards, as the other Fianna Fail senators were. But to be fair, she was always part of the awkward squad, and the party may well have felt that it didn't owe her that. Her biggest fight with de Valera was over the Constitution. In 1937, she was no longer a Senate, but was still a party member, in sympathy with the women TDs who united in opposition to the women clauses. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington asked her to write a letter supporting their view, which was published in the press. She based her opposition to the clauses on the promises of equality made in the Proclamation. Calls were made for her to resign from the party or being thrown out for disrespecting the chief, but she was able to demonstrate that de Valera had given permission for people to argue the matter. One of the loudest calls for her resignation came from her own common, the Thomas Clarke common, which she had founded. But she refused. She stayed on the National Executive, though aware she was not very popular, but she attended no meetings between 1939 and 1943, which is a period including her mayoralty. This largely ended her political career. She stood for MacBride's Clan na Poblachtha in 1948, but without success. She was 70 then and would have seemed merely a blast from the past. In 1951, she offered her assistance and her car to John A. Costello, Fine Gael Taoiseach, for the upcoming election, praising his spirit of cooperation. I don't know if this offer was followed through, but it certainly demonstrates political pragmatism or possibly revenge. She remained aloof from women's groups such as the Women's Political and Social League, and despite her disillusionment with Fianna Fail, continued to feel that the structure of a political party was necessary if one was not to be a lone voice crying in the wilderness. She never tried to stand as an independent. Outside her political career, I also examined a few of the arguments and controversies she later engaged in, and some of her personal relationships. She had an interesting relationship with Michael Collins. In the memoir, she's very definite about her role in choosing Michael Collins as secretary of the INVDF, the Volunteer Dependence Fund, because that gave him a position from which he was able to bring together the threads of the IRB again. She says, after talking to him for a while, I decided he was just the man I had been hoping for, describing his forceful personality, his wonderful magnetism, and his organising ability. Now, this position was an elected one, and the committee to elect him was mostly composed of female relatives of the executed leaders. They were not impressed by Collins' very casual manner. But he had the support of the men who had been interned with him in Fronglock, and they influenced their contacts on the committee. He clearly did target Clarke in particular, recognising her influence and status on the committee. So she did not actually lie about the procedure of his employment, but she shaped it so that she seemed to have played a more prominent part in the choice. This gets to the heart of memoir as an historical record. Everyone has an agenda, acknowledged or not. And she had created this story over very many years, and it had taken shape in her mind, but it didn't exactly reflect what actually happened. Although they disagreed on the treaty, Clarke continued to respect Collins' memory, even though she had doubts about his drinking habits. She says he reminded her forcibly of the magnetic and charming Seán MacDiarmada, but she may also have seen something of Tom in him, someone who was happy to work in the background without necessarily wanting to claim all the credit. MacDiarmada was a very important figure in the lives of Tom and Kathleen. Tom admired him greatly, and Seán, rather astutely, also became close to other members of the Daly family in Limerick, particularly John Daly. My aunt used to tell me that half the Daly sisters were in love with Seán MacDiarmada. He apparently had a certain charm. MacDiarmada was much nearer Kathleen's age than Tom was, and Brian Feeney, in his biography of MacDiarmada, has surmised that Kathleen's feelings for Seán were deeper than she could admit. Certainly when she visited him in prison, the warder hinted that she was his girlfriend, so it must have looked a possibility. But even if they did care for one another, neither of them would or could have done anything about it. Spies lurked everywhere, watching all the nationalists. And MacDiarmada himself was a very committed revolutionary. Even his letters to his fiancée, Min Ryan, are very unromantic. Besides, this was a generation of stern moral principle, as opposed to the scandalous habits of the British, as exposed in tabloid newspapers. They held themselves to higher standards. A tiny bit of evidence that they maintained a distance is in the small penciled note that reached Kathleen a few weeks after the rising. It had a note from Tom on one side and from Seán on the other. I could imagine Seán's grin of mischief when he wrote, "Dear Caught," she writes, as he'd never dared to address me as other than Mrs. Clarke in all our years of friendship and comradeship. It was a very formal age. Another controversy she was involved with was the fact that she never accepted that Pearse had been named as President of the Republic during Easter week. She states in her memoir that when Tom told her he was first signatory of the Proclamation, that meant he would be president. But the War News, published by the IRB during the rising, states definitively that Pearse was Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Republic and President of the Provisional Government. It is highly unlikely that Pearse would have unilaterally taken this position on himself. It must have been agreed by the Provisional Government. But the passage of years made no difference to Kathleen's passion on the matter. Tom may not have wanted such a position. He once told Kathleen that he did not have the necessary ruthlessness, but I well believe that he would not discuss it with Kathleen in their final interview, knowing she would be angry at any change. She was certainly extremely upset in 1966 when a commemorative medal was struck with Pearse on the front, and she said in a letter, "Tom being president was the one consolation I had." She held this view to the end of her life, no matter how much evidence contradicted it. The memoir gives a long account of their final interview, and of course there was no other witnesses. I don't wish to imply that it is not a truthful account, but she states that Tom told her that, as president, he was the first to shoot the lock of the GPO, the first to enter and order the occupants out, the last to leave it, while simultaneously being the first to lead the dash across to Moore Street when others hesitated. In a later interview, she adds that it was Tom who handed the proclamation to Pearse to read out. There are numerous other accounts of these events, and none of them corroborate this version, so either Tom embellished his memories or Kathleen built on whatever he told her in his last interview. In 1938, Winifred Carney took issue with statements made by Kathleen, complaining of the inaccurate statement that Tom Clarke gave the command at the seizure of the GPO. The orders to halt and to charge were given by James Connolly, for I walked beside him. Desmond Ryan, in a subsequent letter, quotes several reports which contradict her account of Tom being last to leave the GPO. He says he tried to remind Mrs. Clarke that wrangling over inessentials may increase the cynicism of the rising generation. But these inessentials gradually took possession of her, and she would not let them go. Another aspect I looked at was health. She seems to have suffered most of her life from poor health, but she gives very little detail about it in the memoir. When she and Tom lived in Long Island, in New York, she spent several months in a nursing home with her baby Daly, but this is not mentioned in the memoir. It's revealed in letters that they exchanged at the time. The cause isn't given, but may have been a miscarriage. As she was only 21 when she married, 3 children in 15 years is not many for the time, so there may have been more than one miscarriage. She talks about her 1916 miscarriage because she almost died and she needed to explain that illness. The only other time she dwells on her health is during her imprisonment in Holloway, because it was the cause of her early release. She began to suffer from a heart condition and was persuaded to ask for release when the prison doctor witnessed her having a severe attack. The family in Limerick had collected several letters from doctors attesting to Kathleen's poor health, which would be further damaged by imprisonment. They all speak of an unspecified internal operation, possibly a hysterectomy. The odds are that she would have been very annoyed by these letters if she had read them. She hated being regarded as weak in any way. Later in 1919, she was sent to hospital by Dr. Lynn when she began coughing up blood. This is mentioned in the memoir, probably to highlight the ruthlessness of the Dublin Metropolitan Police in searching her house while she lay in bed. After the death of Terence McSweeney in 1920, she attended a memorial mass in the Pro Cathedral, and a piece in Madge Daly's unpublished memoir states that Kathleen became unwell and Collins sent her home in a special car. Madge adds she was dangerously ill and her life was despaired of for weeks. This episode is not in the memoir. When she was Lord Mayor of Dublin, again she spent several weeks in hospital following a serious operation in 1940, but again she does not specify the cause. Another interesting facet of her life is her relationship with her children. They do not feature very much in the memoir, except when she's describing rage during the War of Independence and the Civil War. Indeed, when she regretted, during their last interview with Tom, that she could not die with him, he reminded her that she had to live for the children, who would need her even more. They're not featured at all in the memoir after the Civil War period, even though Emmett, the youngest, moved into the mansion house with her in 1939. Daly, the eldest son, suffered diphtheria when he was 3 years old and it affected his health for the rest of his life, and it was he whom Kathleen worried about most when she was in Holloway, writing agitatedly to Madge about his education and his health and complaining that he never wrote to her. Well, Daly was 16 then and had suffered the traumatic loss of his father in 1916 and the loss of his mother to an unknown period of imprisonment. His mother and his aunt blamed him for being lazy at school and uncaring, but he'd been through frightening experiences and he suffered several more during the raids of the War of Independence. They don't seem to have any sort of sense of what the effects of this trauma were on him. Kathleen admitted in later life that she never really bonded with her second son, Tom. She left him in Limerick after he was born while she helped Tom set up his shop, and it was more than a year before they actually lived together, and in fact she had to more or less fight her mother to get him back. She was close to her youngest child, Emmett, however, and he remembered his father quite well, though he was only 6 when Tom was executed. Interviewed by Donegal Dooling in 1991, his voice broke down when he recalled his father playing with him. I talked to him after that, and he was very embarrassed. He said he'd made a fool of himself. But it was a very touching interview, and it was natural that such memories would be upsetting. He was no longer a man in his 80s, he was suddenly that 6-year-old boy who remembered playing with his dad. Kathleen's concern for her sons varied. She was always worried that they might be sort of disappeared. As sons of Tom Clarke, they might be targeted by, for example, the Black and Tans. But she often put them in harm's way herself. Sometime after the rising, she travelled from Limerick with them, carrying gold for Collins, and camouflaged them as a family party so they were allowed through without a search. This must have been nerve-wracking for the boys, who no doubt were technically prepared to die for Ireland, but perhaps not quite yet. But they could all have been shot by the Black and Tans if the gold had been found. The morning of her arrest, in May 1918, was another frightening experience for them. She made no effort to soften them, informing them that she had been taken by the people who had murdered their father and uncle, and that she did not expect to be back before the end of the war. They must have feared she would also die. She adds, Emmett was sneaking his handkerchief to wipe away a few tears that had escaped. I pretended not to see and was nearer tears myself than they knew. So Emmett, aged 8, had not only learned that tears were shameful and to be concealed, but was not allowed to see how much his mother cared that she was being separated from them. For her, the most important thing was not to show weakness before the enemy. Her memoir is interesting in tracing the path of a light-hearted young woman with golden hair and blue eyes, from a hard-working dressmaker to a talented organiser and money manager with a steely commitment to a political cause, an equal partner with one of Ireland's most ruthless revolutionaries. The assertive side was always there. She was combative in the family environment, particularly with her sister Madge, in spite or perhaps because of the fact that Madge frequently aided her financially. When Markovitz wrote to her after they both left Holloway, she said, "I wonder whose nose you are biting off now." And she was an argumentative woman. She always asked after her mother and sisters in letters, but seems happier at a distance. During her political years, when she served on numerous boards and committees, she was often chairperson, which demonstrates the respect in which she was held. But as she aged, she seems to have retreated within herself, and her later letters contain many references to loneliness. Always sharp-tongued, she became increasingly difficult to deal with. It is still astonishing that she maintained a high public profile for so long, more so when considering the state of her health throughout her life. What is notable about her political career is that she achieved one at all, let alone held on to it for many years, while other women were sidelined, ignored, or simply became disillusioned with politics and walked away. It is clear that women who had fought through the revolution, or who later wished to put themselves forward for election, were gradually marginalised in Ireland's 20th century public life. Some of this related to the bitterness following the Civil War, when women were seen as diehards and warmongers. But there was also a strong fascist influence, seeing women as incapable of involvement in work or politics. Kathleen Clarke fought off prejudice and ostracism to maintain her position in the Oireachtas, and in Dublin City Council she topped the election poll several times. This was not due solely to her status as a 1916 widow. She earned her positions and carried them through with a strong resolve, but by the time she left public life, there were fewer women than ever in the Oireachtas. There are not any huge results from the research I have done over 2.5 years. I've uncovered more detail about her life than she gave and filled in some gaps, but it's not possible to enter into anyone else's mind, certainly not someone dead over 50 years and born in the century before last. But I hope I have managed to emphasise her importance in the development of what became the Irish Republic, and I've laid down, I hope, a marker for someone else to follow. This is probably my swan song, talking about Kathleen Clarke. I've been talking about her and lecturing about her and publishing articles about her since 1991. And I think I've run my course here. I don't think I owe her any more. But there's still a lot of research to be carried out, and she deserves not only a full-scale biography, but also a much higher place in the lists of those women who worked for Ireland, not only in the revolutionary period, but after. It is very irritating to see lists of women. More and more there are lists of women as people do research the period, but Kathleen Clarke rarely occurs. There's always Markovitz and Gael and then, a few others, and you rarely find her. No matter what I have done, and no matter what her memoir has done, she falls between too many stools, I think. She's kind of seen as a widow, and somebody who was married to somebody who was important. But she had a tremendous career of her own and worked very hard for it and had to fight very hard for it as well. Excuse me. So I think it's time she got a bit more of her due. However, I'm delighted to say that the Dublin City Council has started to do something towards this because, in September 2022, they commissioned a portrait of Kathleen Clarke as the first woman Lord Mayor of Dublin, which hangs in the City Council chamber opposite Daniel O'Connell. It was painted by Gareth Reid, and it's well past time that happened. You can see she's wearing there the chain of conscience, which compares with the extremely elaborate chain being worn by all the other massive portraits in that room. But I was very proud and glad to be there on that occasion. And it was some recognition of her, and I hope there will be more. Thank you.